Sometimes the people closest to us can be the ones hiding the darkest secrets. I never thought I'd be sharing a story like this, but here I am, still trying to process everything that happened last month. It started on what seemed like a normal day when my sister's husband, Mark, asked my wife to meet him for coffee. He said he needed advice about something important. When my wife mentioned this to me that evening, she seemed a bit puzzled but not particularly worried. "Do you think everything's okay with him and Sarah?" she asked, referring to my sister. "Maybe they're having some problems, and he wants an outside perspective?" I found it a bit odd since Mark had never reached out to my wife like this before. Sure, he'd text her and other family members about everyday stuff, kids' schedules, family gatherings, that sort of thing, but he'd never asked to meet one-on-one. Still, we were all pretty close as a family, always there to support each other through rough patches, so I didn't think too much of it. "Go ahead," I said, brushing off my slight unease. Maybe he just needs someone to talk to. The next day, my wife decided to meet him at a small coffee shop near her workplace. As she was getting ready that morning, she mentioned it again. "I'm still not sure what this is about," she said, sounding slightly concerned. "Just hear him out," I said reassuringly. "If it's something serious, we'll figure out how to help." The coffee shop she chose was bustling with the lunch crowd, which made her feel more comfortable about the meeting. She got there early and picked a table near the window. When Mark arrived, she immediately noticed something was off. He seemed unusually nervous, nothing like his typically confident self. They made small talk for a few minutes, chatting about work and the kids. But as soon as their drinks arrived, everything changed. Mark took a deep breath and started telling my wife how beautiful she was. At first, she thought he was just being polite, but he kept going. He told her she'd always been the light in his life and that she made him feel things he'd never felt before. "I've loved you since the first time I saw you," he confessed, his voice shaking. "If you were with me, I'd treat you like the queen you deserve to be. I'd give you everything you want." My wife sat there in shock, unable to process what was happening. This man, my sister's husband, father to their 2 young kids, someone we trusted completely, was declaring his love for her. He wouldn't stop, making grand promises about how wonderful their life could be together. When she tried to interrupt, to tell him he was making a terrible mistake, he just talked over her, like he'd rehearsed this speech countless times. The worst part? Mark had always been the perfect brother-in-law. He was great with our kids, always showed up for family events, and was the life of every gathering. He'd text my wife regularly, but was always about normal family stuff, coordinating schedules, planning get-togethers, nothing that would raise any red flags. He was just as friendly with my mom and everyone else in the family. We all thought he was one of the good ones. When my wife told me all this later, it felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. She'd left the coffee shop immediately, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she stood up. She was shaking when she called me, and while we were on the phone, the messages from Mark started flooding in. First came the apologies. He didn't mean it. It was just infatuation. He was sorry for making her uncomfortable. But the damage was already done. My wife left work early to come home and talk about it, her phone constantly buzzing with his calls and messages. I told her to answer one of his calls and put it on speaker so I could hear. He was crying, begging her not to tell my sister. He kept insisting it was a mistake, that he misread the signals, that he thought she felt the same way. Apparently, he convinced himself that my wife had been flirting with him during our family gathering the previous weekend. He claimed they'd had a moment alone in our kitchen. My wife is naturally outgoing and likes to joke around. That's just her personality. I can see how someone might misinterpret her friendliness, but this was way beyond anything we could have imagined. When Mark asked if she told me about his confession, I spoke up since I was listening on speaker. He immediately started pleading with both of us to keep it secret. The conversation went on for a while, with him begging and us listening. I had to know one thing. Had he cheated on my sister before? He swore he hadn't, claiming it was only my wife he had feelings for. "You should understand," he said to me. "It's just her. It's always been her." I'd heard enough at that point and told him we'd talk tomorrow. Now we were stuck with this mess, unsure what to do next. My wife wanted to drive straight to my sister's house and tell her everything, but the thought of destroying my sister's family made me sick. I couldn't stop thinking about what this would do to my niece and nephew. I knew telling my sister was the right thing to do, but I was also worried about my wife. Even though none of this was her fault, I feared there would be resentment from my family. Even if my sister forgave Mark, and they worked things out, things would never be the same between all of us. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Around midnight, my sister called. My heart dropped as she told me she needed to talk about something urgent. Mark had gone to her in tears, claiming my wife had tried to start an affair with him. He'd completely twisted the story, making my wife out to be the instigator. I could barely believe what I was hearing. I told my sister that wasn't true at all and said I'd be right over. This needed to be handled face to face, not over the phone. I hung up and immediately called my parents, quickly explaining the situation. My dad was furious, and my mom was in shock, but they agreed to go to my sister's house to help with the kids. Next, I called my younger brother Tommy, who promised to come watch our kids so they wouldn't be alone during all this. His calm presence would be good for them. Meanwhile, my wife was getting ready, her face pale and drawn. She was dreading the confrontation, but knew it had to happen. The drive to my sister's house felt like it took forever. When we arrived, my sister and Mark were on the front porch. He looked defeated, probably because he knew we had proof, all the texts and voicemails that showed he was lying. I still don't understand what he thought he'd achieve by trying to blame my wife. Maybe he thought he could save himself by getting ahead of the story. The tension was thick as we walked up. My wife was trembling, but determined. Without a word, she handed my sister her phone. My sister's hands were steady as she read through the texts and listened to the voicemails, her expression growing harder with each one. Before she could say anything, Mark broke down sobbing. It was surreal seeing this tough paramedic, someone who deals with life and death situations daily, completely falling apart. His cries were raw and desperate, full of regret and fear. My sister stood there stone-faced, waiting for him to finish. When he finally quieted down, still hiccuping with leftover sobs, she spoke in a voice that could freeze hell. "Pack a bag and get out. I can't even look at you right now." He tried to argue, to plead his case, but she cut him off sharply. "Stop. There's nothing you can say to make this better." Then she turned away from him, walked over to my wife, and hugged her tight. They'd been friends since college, and seeing their bond remain strong despite everything was a small comfort in this nightmare. That left me standing there with Mark. He was a wreck, looking at me with pleading eyes, searching for understanding or forgiveness. But I had none to give. When he tried to speak, I cut him off. "You need to leave," I said firmly. "This is your mess. Deal with the consequences." The rest of that night was chaos. While Mark packed his things, my sister started questioning my wife, trying to understand why her husband would think he had a chance. She insisted their marriage had been fine, everything normal. My wife was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she tried to make sense of it all. "Look through everything," my wife said, handing over her phone again. Together, they went through 2 years' worth of text messages, looking for anything inappropriate. But there was nothing, just normal family conversations. My wife has always been playful and teasing with everyone, including my mom and Tommy. It's just who she is. The only thing my wife could think of that might have been misinterpreted was from our last family gathering. She and Mark had both reached for the fridge at the same time, playfully bumping into each other. He let her go first, but then reached around her waist to grab a beer, his hand moving slowly. She admitted it fell off in the moment, but she brushed it aside, not wanting to make a big deal out of nothing. Now she wondered if her silence had somehow encouraged him. My sister listened, her expression softening. She didn't blame my wife. She knew her well enough to understand that her friendly nature wasn't an invitation for anything more. "This isn't your fault," she assured her, though I could see the guilt still weighing on my wife. But then things took an even darker turn. My sister decided to check Mark's laptop, guessing his password on the third try. What she found was disturbing, a folder full of pictures of my wife, dating back years. These weren't normal family photos. They were all isolated shots of just her, taken without her knowledge. One set of photos particularly stood out. 2 years ago, we'd all gone on a couple's trip to a beach resort. My wife, feeling comfortable in the adults-only setting, had worn a bikini, something she rarely does. There were dozens of secret photos of her from that trip, each one taken when she wasn't looking. My sister's face went pale as she scrolled through them, realizing her husband had been secretly photographing my wife for years, collecting these images like some kind of stalker. "Should we get a restraining order?" my sister wondered out loud, her voice barely a whisper. This had gone from inappropriate to downright creepy. My wife was in shock, having no idea he'd been doing this, no clue about his obsession. The next night, my sister agreed to let Mark explain himself over FaceTime, with my wife present to ensure there would be no more lies. I listened off camera, my heart pounding. My sister recorded everything. Mark looked exhausted, his eyes swollen from crying. He admitted he'd been obsessed with my wife for years, since before he even started dating my sister. He claimed it began as a physical attraction but grew into something more as he spent time around her. He became fixated on everything about her, her laugh, her personality, the way she moved. He described how he'd try to be near her at family events, make excuses to text her, always watching her. He convinced himself that she might feel the same way, living in this fantasy world he'd created in his head. My sister and wife exploded at that point, years of betrayal and violated trust pouring out in a storm of anger and hurt. My wife hung up, shaking, and turned to me, desperately assuring me it had all been one-sided. I believed her, I always had. Even if she'd ever found him attractive, I knew she'd never act on it. She's serious about trust and loyalty. Later that night, Mark sent my wife an email from a new account. It started as an apology, but quickly turned dark. He wrote paragraphs about everything he loved about her, insisted there was sexual tension between them, and then spent a long time criticizing me, my appearance, my personality, everything. He was certain I wasn't satisfying my wife properly. Reading it made me sick, but instead of feeling threatened, it just made me more determined to protect my family from his delusions. We forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. My sister is filing for divorce and full custody of the kids, using all the evidence of Mark's unstable behavior, the texts, voicemails, photos, and now this email. He's back at their house temporarily because legally she can't keep him out yet, but he seems defeated, knowing he's lost everything. The kids don't know what's happening yet. Mark was never around much anyway, always working extra shifts at his job, so his absence isn't unusual. My sister has already talked to a child psychologist to help them through this when the time comes. My wife is slowly getting better, though she feels guilty for being too trusting around Mark. She's naturally stunning and used to male attention, but she felt safe with him because he was family. She never imagined he'd cross these lines. Thankfully, she and my sister are still close. There's no resentment there. Some friends have suggested there must be other women, that someone this obsessive couldn't fixate on just one person. But as far as we can tell, it really was just my wife. His obsession with her was so complete, there wasn't room for anyone else. We're all still processing everything, taking it day by day. The support from friends and family has been incredible, helping us navigate this nightmare. It'll take time, but we'll be okay. The main focus now is protecting the kids and helping my sister build a new life. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you never really know what's going on in someone's head, even someone you think you can trust completely. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.